you everyone for attending today's webinar. And at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Bill Heaven.
Thanks, Michelle. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today on our webinar. So good afternoon and welcome. Again, as Michelle said, my name is Bill Heaven. I'm a Senior Director here at HBK. I'm in our Risk Advisory Service practice. And again, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. We're going to be continuing our 2021 webinar series discussing cybersecurity risk. And this afternoon, we're going to talk about a very interesting topic, and that is data destruction. So our agenda is up on the screen right now, but I'm just going to go through a few housekeeping and logistical issues to pretty much similar if you've been on the webinars like a lot of you have. But we've muted all the incoming lines. So if you do experience any problems during the webinar, please feel free to communicate with Michelle. She'll be monitoring the meeting center little thing you do that's in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. And then we're going to plan on leaving 5 to 10 minutes at the end of our session for questions. But if you have questions during the webinar, please feel free to send them into Michelle through the meeting control center, and we'll queue those up. And there was a PDF copy available of today's slide in the meeting center that you can have access to. Additionally, we are recording today's webinar, and we will send out both a link to the recording as well as a copy of the slides in a PDF format for those of you that choose to, because it's such great content that you want to go back and listen to it again. So that'll be available to you as well. Okay, so today we are offering CPE for the session, and we've put forth these 5 learning objectives, which we anticipate would be the takeaways that you would have after attending today's session. So I'm not gonna read them verbatim there, but they're up on the slide screen. They were also in the meeting invite that we sent out that was used when all of you registered for today's webinar. Again, as I've said before, I'm Bill Heaven. I've been with HBK since the summer of 2018. I have internal responsibilities with our IT security as well as doing some client-facing work. So again, welcome to today's webinar. Today I'm joined by Jennifer and Kevin Lamar of Northern Shores Services. Jennifer and Kevin, welcome to our webinar series.
Thank you, Bill.
So with that being said, let's go ahead and get started and take a look at data destruction and the risk, because there really is a risk to overlooking it. So we want to talk about that. Jennifer, Kevin, I'll turn it over to you, and we can start off by educating our audience a little bit about Northern Shore Services.
Great. Thank you, Bill. And thank you to Hilbarth and King and having Jennifer and I here. It's an honor, and we're proud to be part of this. Northern Shore Services, we are a husband and wife team. Obviously, Jennifer and Kevin Lamar. Jennifer is our CEO and president, and I work in the business development area. We perform, in a nutshell, electronic data destruction services. Our company evolved from some of our work down in D.C. in the recycling arena, and we realized there's a true need there for small to medium-sized businesses that are looking for some solutions related to how to destroy our data, what type of procedures and policies we should put in place. And that's how Northern Shore Services was created. We sanitize storage media, and we do that whether it's on-site at our client's facility, which is a very important option, or doing it off-site at our Ohio location, and that's located in Streetsboro between Akron and Cleveland. Some of the clients that we handle are healthcare, manufacturing, finance, and IT, and you can see that our focus is simple and our approach is just as simple. We look at what our clients need, whether it's an off-site or on-site service. We'll talk some more about that. The true benefit to working with our company and the industry in general is the receipt of destruction reports and certificates of destruction under auditable, reportable reporting documents. That's very important. When we look at our projects, we look at a scope of work, a chain of custody, what type of media needs sanitized or destroyed, and then the recycling of the IT assets after the data is removed. The next screen, we talk about some of the services we provide that I referenced earlier, and it's very important as our clients and your clients or companies that are looking at developing your own policy of data destruction, that you look at what it is. What is the project? What is the problem? And what is the best way to go about doing that? And we'll talk about some different approaches regarding it. One of the things that we wanted to open up with is the screen referencing the $60 million civil money penalty against Morgan Stanley. We wanted to not go line by line, but more so talk about the important points of this. There's an author, Jim Rohn, that wrote some books on business development and running successful operations. And he said that we invest too much money and time following people's successes rather than following their failures. And that you can gain a whole lot more by following someone who has repeatedly failed multiple times in order to learn how to better improve how to run your company. Now with Morgan Stanley, they didn't fail just once, they failed twice. And the OCC got a hold of this and assessed this civil penalty. And it's important to walk through what happened and how it happened. The bank failed to effectively evaluate and address the risks associated with decommissioning its hardware. Now, whether you're a large company like Morgan Stanley or a small business operation, the risks are the risks. You still assess them the same way. The second point, that they failed to assess the risk connected with subcontracting the decommissioning work. You're the client, you control the throttle and the brake. It's important that you make sure you're downstream, your subcontractors are doing what they're supposed to do. The third point is maintaining appropriate inventory of the data and the IT assets. That's another issue that caused a problem for Morgan Stanley. So what's important to understand is the facts related to the case. And the case is that Morgan Stanley had two data processing service centers that they decommissioned assets. They outsourced the data destruction and to a company called Triple Crown, who in turn sold those assets to a company called Anything IT, and who subsequently sold those assets again to Cruise.com. So you have a downstream that included three players there. Here's where it gets strange, is that Morgan Stanley required certificates of destruction. Triple Crown provided certificates of indemnification and represented that they were certificates of destruction, and Morgan Stanley bought it. That's the way it's represented, and we provided a link in the prior screen to reference that. But it's really important that as a company that you understand what you're asking your subcontractor to do and in turn, if they're doing what you're supposed to be doing. Now, the reason this all came to light is that CruiseCom sold those IT assets on the secondary market. A consumer bought those hard drives and booted them up in their own systems and found Morgan Stanley data on those hard drives. The defense of anything IT and CruiseCom was that they weren't hired to destroy data. They were only hired to provide certificates of indemnification and to recycle the IT assets. So you could see from this failure from a number of aspects that the project was mismanaged, and that's why it's very important that as a small business, as you set up your policies and procedures for data destruction, that you're doing it under the best case scenarios and under best practices. Now that was Morgan Stanley's response to it, and now Bill, you had a question?
Yeah, for those of you that are looking for CPE, Michelle has put up the first CPE checkpoint question. So for those of you that want the CPE, just give us your best guess there. Hopefully it's not too challenging. And then Michelle, when you see that we've got pretty much a decent amount of participation based on the audience, go ahead and flip the screen so we can get moving on with the presentation.
Okay, thank you. The reason we opened up with that case study for Morgan Stanley was to show the importance and how critical handling a data destruction project is, no matter how big or small your company is. Jennifer and I, through Northern Shores Services, we talked to business owners, IT directors, IT management firms, and other companies to help them with this process. Some of the things that come up that cause us to have projects are related to new technology, upgrades to equipment, some changing in staffing levels. Interesting that as you repurpose hard drives, maybe from your sales and your finance team, and maybe move those hard drives into your units that are used on plant floors or in the repair and maintenance section of your company, you want to make sure that the data is sufficiently erased and wiped, and in the case when you're repurposing those hard drives so other departments don't have access to financial or sales data. You would be surprised in our conversations, even though Morgan Stanley is located in a number of places across the U.S., primarily in New York, you have government entities that are within 30 to 45 minutes from northeastern Ohio that are managing their data in some strange ways. They're destroying data that's under unconventional methods. There's lack of serial number recording, and it's quite concerning for us as consumers that we have government entities that aren't handling things under best practices. So it's very easy probably for a small business to say, that's how large companies operate, it won't happen to me. But we're here to say that it could happen, and we have some ways to work through that. The next slide talks about the benefits of data destruction and asset recycling. You have to look at the security issue, the convenience, space constraints, time, and conditions. And those are some elements of how to craft your policy or procedure for your respective company. It's easy to focus on cost, and there's a variety of cost structures out there, but it's really important that you look at how to efficiently and effectively accomplish what you want to do with your policy. So now I'd like to turn it over to Jennifer, our CEO, to walk through some NIST guidelines and definitions.
Okay, before we get into the meat and potatoes of the policy, here are just a few basic terms to help navigate NIST guidelines. Media versus data. Media is the physical platform where the information is stored, such as drives, flashcards, tapes, etc. Data is the information itself. Data destruction is the process of removing data found on the media, either by destroying the media or by rendering the data inaccessible. Media destruction is the process of destroying the actual storage media in order to destroy the data on it. Data wiping is also known as erasure, and it's the process of removing data from the media by overwriting it. This leaves the media intact and available for possible reuse. Then there are the types of media. There is hard drive disks, solid state drives, flash media, magnetic tapes. As we'll discuss later, there are different destruction methods for each type of media. What works for one may not necessarily be appropriate for another. NIST Special Publication 800-88 Rev 1 was published by the National Institute of Standards and Technology in December of 2014. It provides general instructions on acceptable media sanitation methods. It's intended as a guideline for the development of an organization's data destruction policy. The objective of NIST is to assist with the decision-making when media requires disposal, reuse, or will be leaving the control of your organization. Organizations should develop and use local policies to make effective risk-based decisions on disposition. So what does that mean exactly? Well, it's the responsibility of the information owner to identify data categories and confidentiality levels and to determine the level of media sanitization required for their organization. Information disposition decisions can occur throughout the information timeline. However, they're most intense during the end of the life phase. As mentioned, several methods can be used to sanitize your media. To decide on the appropriate method of sanitization for your organization, should follow along with the following points. Categorize the security level of the information to be disposed. Assess the media on which it's stored. Evaluate the risk to the confidentiality, and determine the future of the media. The selected method should be appraised according to cost, environmental impact, and factors such as those. However, in the end, you have to choose what best mitigates the risks to an unauthorized disclosure of information. The following are some factors to consider when making your decisions. The type and storage capacity of the media. CDs, hard drives, solid state drives require different methods of physical destruction. The time required to erase or overwrite a 2 terabyte hard drive is much greater than the time needed to erase a 64 gig HDD. Security and confidentiality of the data. Does your data include personnel files, financial information, medical records, confidential meeting minutes, etc., etc.? This is an important point in that those are questions that only your organization could answer about your data. Is the physical location of the media. Is it located in a secure, controlled access area? Are there power requirements to consider? Do you have loose drives, or are they contained in a unit? It's much easier for someone to walk out of your organization with a drive versus a desktop unit. So those are items to consider. Then there's the personnel performing your sanitization. Does staff exist within your organization who can perform the function, or should the task be performed by an outside contractor?
So Jennifer, just reading between the lines on that, do we just basically have to assume that if you don't start out knowing what types of data you have and you don't know where it's at, you're kind of going to be in a pickle?
Well, you'll be behind the 8 ball a little bit, but I believe most organizations are to begin with. You could only start where you could start, right at the beginning, and most people probably have tons of old hard drives sitting in a storage area someplace. I think you have to try to determine the age of them, if at all possible, to see how long they've been around. And then, but more importantly, if you move forward from this point on, you should probably have your individual users take a look at the hard drives that they're using currently, so that if you wanted a starting place, you would be able to at least categorize data on your current hard drives.
Okay, great.
So then there's also volume of media to be sanitized, and like we discussed, you could have an office that maybe has 10 drives, or as we often see, there are storage areas or warehouses containing dozens or even hundreds of drives. That's really not that unusual. We run into that quite frequently. Availability of the equipment. Does your organization have access to the tools you need to perform the method correctly? Do you have the software that's needed for erasure or the physical crushing or shredding equipment? Training level personnel is important. Is the person who's responsible for performing the method really familiar with the process? And there's the time requirement, which everybody always has to consider. So data erasure for a solid state drive can easily be accomplished in probably about 5 minutes or less. But you could take that same procedure, say for erasure, and have a large capacity HDD, and that could easily take several hours to erase. Now, that's not all exactly active time, but you would have to have somebody monitoring it just the same. Then there's a cost of standardization. You have to consider the cost of the equipment and the software, and of course the cost of the time required to train your employees. In addition, I'd like to add that there's your disposal of your physically destroyed media. So if you have hard drives on site and you're doing the shredding or the crushing by yourself, you would have obviously the waste that creates, and that would have to be disposed of in some environmentally appropriate manner.
But when I just hit delete on my computer, the file's really gone, right?
Oh, completely. The absolute worst way. We'll discuss that later.
That was a little bit of a joke there.
We will discuss that later.
So let's move on, and I think we'll have our second poll question. So Michelle, if you want to put that up. I hope that when the folks online that want to get CPE, when you look at some of these questions, it would make my day if I knew that you laughed a little bit to yourself when you looked at some of the choices for answers. But that's just a preference of mine.
So some additional considerations you might need to take a look at is the control of the media. This aspect has to be considered when the media leaves your organizational control. And so what does that mean? Well, media control can be transferred when the media is being returned as part of an end-of-lease agreement, or if it could be donated or sold outside of your organization for reuse. And then there's data protection level. Even within an organization, various data protection policies may exist. This has internal applications. For example, a company could have an engineering department and a sales department. The engineering department may not need access, the sales department may not need access to engineering detailed proprietary data, such as codes and schematics, so on and so forth. The engineers probably don't have a need to access the personal information of the company's customers. So within your organization, there are also different levels of data protection. NIST tasks senior managers of a company with creating and maintaining the effective information security program. It outlines the roles of managers to accomplish this. Now, not every organization will possess each of these positions. Especially in smaller organizations, as often the case, the same person may play one or more of these roles. I won't go through all of them in their entirety, but I wanted to point out a few things. So the Chief Information Officer is first and foremost responsible for promulgating the information security policy. You have somebody that could be the information system owner. Then there's the information steward. That person is responsible for supervising on-site media maintenance performed by service providers. So that means if somebody is coming in from an outside organization to look at your equipment, the information steward is responsible for coordinating that and then probably staying with that person and chaperoning them while they're performing the work if possible. There's a senior agency information security officer who confirms that the requirements of the policy are implemented throughout your organization. There's a computer information security manager, system security manager. This one is quite interesting, the property management officer. That person ensures the accountability for sanitized media and devices that are redistributed. And that could mean they're moved, they're within an organization, they're donated, or they're sold or destroyed. This is basically a tracking and inventory function. Accountability of physically destroyed media is recognizable. So if you have a drive that's been crushed or it's been shredded or what have you, that's very easy to account for. However, if you have a drive that's erased, it's not so easy to understand just by looking at it whether it's been erased or not. So this is a very important role of the property management officer. Also important is the records management officer, and that person advises on the retention requirements to prevent destruction of records that should have been retained. This is a very important function because, after all, we all worry about the risk of information being disclosed, but it's equally undesirable, according to regulators in particular, if you get rid of information that you should have retained. Then there's a privacy officer and, of course, the users. Ultimately, the users are responsible for knowing and understanding the confidentiality of the information associated with their projects. Now, NIST defines clear, purge, and destroy as actions that are taken to sanitize the media. If you're familiar at all with the document, you'll see the reoccurring use of these terms over and over again. They're defined as follows. Basically, clear applies logical techniques to sanitize data for protection against simple, non-evasive recovery techniques. Clear usually involves overwriting the software with random patterns or zeros and ones, something along those lines. Purge applies physical, logical techniques that render the data unrecoverable using state-of-the-art recovery methods. And then there's destroy, which not only renders the data unrecoverable using the state-of-the-art techniques, but it also results in the inability to reuse the media, just like the name would imply.
So is the definition of the clear, purge, and destroy, is that going to be possibly regulated for certain industries where you have to destroy a drive as opposed to purging it?
Well, NIST is kind of the guidelines that a lot of other regulatory agencies follow, and so it's the pattern, so you have your policy in place. But it depends on the level of the confidentiality of your information. So clear is considered the probably the bottom rung of things, and so that it is your basic everyday person cannot grab a hold of your drive and be able to do something with your data.
Right.
Purge is a little bit of a more advanced erasure method, so that, and sometimes it depends on your drive as which one it supports, purge or clear or what have you. Some of the older drives don't support both of those methods, but so purge is like a step above, and then destroy, of course, is the ultimate. Destroy would be an absolute foolproof method, but at the same time, it renders your device completely, your media useless.
Right. So I hijacked your slide.
That's okay. So the other factors in the decision-making process are that you start by identifying what types of data are stored on a device. And we mentioned that numerous times, and as we discussed earlier, that may not always be that easy, but if you begin with your users and ask them to identify what's on their current drive, that would be a start. Then you choose the method, the purge, the clear, the destroy, that ultimately preserves the confidentiality of the data, which is the goal here. That's the reoccurring theme. An interesting point is that you consider the length of time the data is to remain sensitive. So if you have certain drives and your regulatory agents want you to have that information retained for those records for, say, 6 years, just as an example. If your drive is from the late 1990s, then obviously that decision is something that you would know you would not need to keep retaining that information. So another point is that purge or clear could be more appropriate than destroy when you're looking at your environmental concerns, if you have a need to reuse the media, and the cost of replacing your devices. Basically, the risk decision should include the consequence of information disclosure and the cost of information retrieval and the cost of sanitization. But as to be pointed out here, if you look at the Morgan Stanley example that Kevin had talked about, it could be very costly indeed if your information leaves your site when it wasn't supposed to. So next, we'll talk briefly about the documentation, although it's a very important point of all of this. You could have the best policy in the world and you could follow all of your procedures, but if you do not have documentation on record for your regulatory agencies, then it's basically as if the process never existed. So once sanitation is complete, the certificate of media disposition is created, and that could either be a hard copy or you could have electronic records maintained, which is usually the case these days. The amount of information varies, but the certificate should include the following: the media information. This is just the manufacturer, model type, so on and so forth of your drive. Then there's the system information, and this is information such as asset tags or ID numbers that are maybe internal to your organization. And then if the drives are wiped, well, in a storage unit, a storage system such as a hard drive being in a desktop or a laptop, you would also want to know the system information, the ID from where the drive was wiped. Then there are sanitization descriptions such as the purge, clear, destroy we discussed. Sanitization method, whether it be something like degaussing, erasing, crushing, shredding, that type of thing. The verification method, now we didn't touch on this too much, but it's very important, and NIST is quite clear about this, that if you use an erasure method, it must be verified in some way. So you can't just erase it, but many softwares have this verification factor built in. So after a drive is erased, then you could go back and verify the erasure. The date, time, and location of the method is important, as well as the name, title, and signature of the person performing the method. So now here are some examples of documentation we provide. And I just wanted to point out here that the format isn't as important as the content in these documents. So something you have or that you create or you receive may look a little different, but as long as it has the basic components we just discussed, then it is a verified document. So this is an example of a physical destruction report. This is created by Northern Source for drives that we crush. This is what an example of a document would be that we send electronically to our customers. It mentions the serial number and then the date and time of destruction, and it gives the information on our equipment use and so on and so forth. Then this is a sample of a data destruction report, which is automatically generated by our erasure software program, and it has all of the items that would be needed on as far as a report goes, and it gives you, again, the model, the serial number. It even gives things such as capacity of the drive. This is configurable, and you could change it around to suit your needs as far as what factors you would like to include in it. And then our final piece of documentation we have are these sample destruction certificates, which very clearly state the information. And this is more of a visual type thing that you would have, say, in a file someplace. If someone came and requested, one of your auditors would request the document, you could just show this to them fairly easily. And then the final point I wanted to make about NIST is that it has several appendices, and the following I wanted to point out as being maybe particularly helpful when you're trying to develop your policy. Appendix A is quite lengthy, and anyone who has any familiarity with it would understand that it goes on forever. But at the same time, it contains a wealth of specific information concerning your devices, and for each device, it lists what's considered clear, purge, and destroy. So it is very useful information. You just have to take the time to kind of slog through it. Appendix B are the terms used in the guide, and that's always helpful. And then finally, Appendix G provides the sample certificate of sanitization, and it just shows you what they consider. I want to point out, though, that as long as you have the factors, again, the format isn't the end all. It's that your document has everything that it needs as far as content goes.
Okay, so I believe that's going to take us to our third checkpoint. There, thanks, Michelle. I got a chuckle here in the room, so that's good. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the next agenda item, and Kevin's going to talk to us a little more about data wiping and some disposal destruction techniques.
Great, thanks, Bill. I want to compliment Jennifer on condensing the NIST document. That document is 50 plus pages, and this dashboard or this PDF that was assembled is a great document to help a small, medium-sized business figure out where they need to move to next, in addition to calling in us or another company to help them wade through the details. But using some of the information here helps you put that plan together for your own data destruction. The question comes up, what is data wiping, and what actually is an erasure? And there's a picture of a unit on the right-hand side that we have some other pictures as well. But what it does is it writes some meaningless data across the entire storage area, and it replaces what was previously stored. Some people do a file deletion or disk formatting, but that changes the pointer, but it leaves the data fully intact, and that's why erasure software is so important. Jennifer was presenting a sample report of an erasure report that we provide. You know what's interesting with the software? In past jobs, we wanted to footnote certain characters connected with drives that we were erased, and the software refused to let you do that. I mean, that document is generated from the software itself and cannot be managed or manipulated. And that's one of the advantages of having a software system do the erasure. Some of the disadvantages is time-consuming. It can be a little complex. I think it's very cost-effective to have a third party do it, and you would be surprised how low in cost it is. The next slide, please. And some pictures of what that looks like. On the left side is an actual unit that has fan-out kits connected to hard drives, and it gives you on the right side the screen presentation of the different drives and what level they are at as far as pass wiping or not. Some people bring up with physical destruction degaussing, and what that is it takes two forms. It's an independent magnet that goes over an HDD and will cause the drive to be inoperable and the data to be erased. Another one is a single unit that you slide the drive in, and through an intense magnetic field causes the data to be erased and the drive to be inoperable. The problem is there's no reporting system that comes with that, and it can only be used on HDDs. So SDDs, it won't work. Although it is sold in the marketplace that you just run a wand over an HDD, you don't have a third-party reference point to track that. So there's no physical feedback there. The shredding is another option. In the next slide, we talk about using a certain strip cut or cross cut. The issue with shredding is that you contract a shred truck to show up at your office location, and they obviously want a minimum number of drives to be there. Your employees, if they want to witness this, have to walk out in the parking lot no matter what the weather is to witness the actual shredding that takes place if you want to witness that. It's a little expensive. It's effective. And obviously the shred sizes are important to fall in line with your procedure. So the other slide under physical destruction is the crushing method. Some of the jobs that Jennifer and I have been involved in, our clients want the hard drives to stay on site and not leave their location. This crushing unit can be set up in a desk office. It's not loud. It has a wedge that exerts 7 tons of force, and it ends up crushing a HDD, and then it has a special attachment that you can use for an SDD. And one job that we did at the Empire State Building on the 26th floor, we were able to wheel this crusher up to the server room of a major company and actually crush that data without the data leaving site. So you could see that, and their employees were there to witness that as well. And it was an honor for us to be there, but at the same time, I could see the efficiencies and the effectiveness of this unit. So after you're done destroying the data and documenting it, the IT asset recycling is important. You make sure that there's no labels indicating that your company is associated with that IT asset. I mean, the drive's removed, it's destroyed, so that eliminates that risk. But there's a perception risk. There was a story once, MSP told us that they recycled some IT assets, the drives were removed, and the truck was going down the road, and the desktop unit fell off the truck into the gutter. But the drive wasn't there, but the label was on it from the company, and someone drove by, found that, and all of a sudden connected that, how loose is this company with destroying their data when, their units are laying on the side of the road. So even though you do everything right and you follow the procedures and you document it, there's a public perception there. To finish the job, you have to make sure that the IT asset is recycled and destroyed appropriately to minimize that PR risk associated with the activity. Reuse and refurbish is a big thing. We all see these assets every day that's on the screen, the smart TV, the iPhones, you have DVRs. All of these units have IT assets in there. Jennifer and I were talking have hard drives in it that have data. Jennifer and I were talking the other day, all of us are guilty of it. You hand over your phone or your data-bearing device, and you just assume whoever is going to receive it is going to remove that data appropriately. And maybe all of us, in light of a number of data breaches in the consumer market, should be more aware of our devices and what data we have on those, especially the smart TVs. If you're going to get rid of it because it doesn't work and you go to an electronic recycling site, whether it's privately owned or county owned, you want to make sure your data is off that smart TV and there's not emails sitting on there that someone else could retrieve. I think that's it at that point. So again, Bill, we thank you for the presentation, for allowing us to present and bring up some of these points, and hopefully the listeners were able to connect some dots on assembling their own programs or ways that we could help them with it.
Right. Great information, Kevin and Jennifer. Let's wrap up our last CPE question, and then we'll close it out and take some questions. Okay, as I was saying before, and Kevin alluded to it, I'm very appreciative that both Kevin and Jennifer decided that they'd help us out with this webinar. I think that was very valuable information that they provided to us, and hopefully everybody on the phone feels the same way. So we'll go through some of the questions if anything came in while we're giving the presentation, Michelle. And if we've got a few minutes left here, we seem to be right on time. So if you do ask a question and we don't get to it while we're live on the webinar, we will follow up with you afterwards. And you've got everybody's contact information is up on the screen now. It's also in the presentation that you could have downloaded or that you will be emailed afterwards. So feel free to reach out to myself or Jennifer or Kevin, and if you have any specific questions about a situation that you're dealing with and trying to figure out how to resolve. So we'd be more than happy to answer any questions. So Michelle, do we have anything that came in while we were talking?
Yes, we did have a couple that came in. The first question is, what are the major hurdles that companies seem to face when it comes to data destruction?
So I guess one of you two would probably be best to do that.
I would say what we had touched on a little bit is one of the major hurdles is identifying the information on the drives. And obviously it's the first step. And so they talk about the life cycle of the information, But I think, by human nature, very few people start from the beginning and say, okay, what am I going to do with this data? What's going on this drive, and so on and so forth. So you would have to take into consideration, I guess one of the things like we mentioned was that perhaps if you look at the dates and the age of your drives versus the information that could be on them, and if you wanted something that's a little more, say, more timely, then you would probably, I would say, start with your employees and have them identify, the information on their drives. It could seem overwhelming, I think, at first, is to try to categorize your data, and NIST is very strong on that. And you could say, well, how on earth am I supposed to do that? But it's like anything else, is just with one small step at a time. And so then once you gather the data that's on a drive, then you could go ahead and categorize it into this is personal information on customers, this is proprietary technical information, that type of a thing. So I think that the biggest hurdle is actually just getting started.
I think another point is as you're trying to figure out how big this project is we've had a number of situations where clients have led us down the hallway, opened up a door, and it's filled with IT assets. We come in there, do an inventory by serial number, actually sort out what they have, what they don't have. That gives them a working document from two perspectives to find out how big the project is. Number two, if they didn't keep track of those fixed assets, this is a good way to keep track of it before you dispose of them.
Okay. Michelle, you said we had a couple more questions, so
Yes.
fire away.
The next question is, how often do you suggest that a company utilize the services of a company like yours?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think it depends on the rate of your data generation, and so oftentimes we start our introduction to a company as somebody that's kind of behind the eight ball, and like Kev said, they walk into their conference room and it becomes a storage room for old assets and drives and what have you. So that's like the initial sweep, basically, and then beyond that, I would say it's probably a decent idea to evaluate maybe 2 to 3 times a year to see if you have anything more. And obviously, once the initial purge, as it were, is over, then the data generation rate would drive how often from that point you would have someone come in order to keep yourself current with your policy.
Yeah, we have a financial institution that it's a small bank, and they keep a box in their vault, and they throw their drives in there, and they reach a certain level, and they give us a call. Mm-hmm. And then we have some entities that call us once a year to come and help them with a purge before the end of the year. So it really.
Yeah, I would think that, in my past, I've worked at some different companies, and it would probably depend a lot on what kind of data you have, and then how much space you have, and how adequately you can keep it secure.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Bill, is that space is obviously a concern for everybody. There's very few people who say, oh, we have plenty of space. But the security of that space is very big. As we said, someone could walk in, somebody who's a janitorial service, what have you, wanted to walk in and grab a drive and walk out, or anybody, repair people, that type of thing, even a customer.
Okay. Any other questions, Michelle?
Yes, we had another one come in. It says, can HBK help me get a data destruction and policy process in place?
Absolutely. We we can certainly be of assistance with that, and because you first want to be able to, as I alluded to earlier, you want to know what kind of data you have and figure out an inventory of where it's at, because as Jennifer and Kevin have alluded to, a lot of companies kind of accumulate this data, and maybe it's all on hard drives stored in a conference room or whatnot, but so you need to be able to understand what kind of data you have, where that data is at, and then going from there, then we would reach out and we could possibly work with a company like NSS to actually do the physical destruction of the data. But absolutely, if there's anybody out there looking for assistance to how to get started, how to come up with a policy, and then actually working to do the destruction of the data, between the two companies here on this webinar, we can certainly take care of all your needs there. Any other questions, Michelle? I know we have a couple minutes left, but if we're out of questions, we can certainly give everybody back 5 minutes. Otherwise, we can keep going.
Yeah, we actually just had one testimonial come in that I thought I would share. Our organization has used Northern Shore Services. They did a phenomenal job. Highly recommended.
Oh, thank you very much. We appreciate that. I mean, a lot of times people say good words count, but in our field, it's extraordinarily important to have happy customers because the alternative could be disastrous, really. So
Right.
we very much appreciate those kind words.
You know, if I was a small company going down this road, just quickly, focusing on that scope of work is really important. What your obligations, expectations are, what the providers are, and we follow the IT companies, the IT directors, the managed service providers. They take the lead. We're there to assist in any way possible and do the heavy work from the IT destruction end, but more so the team concept seems to work really well. And as we highlighted in the Morgan Stanley case, know your downstream, know where it's going, know where it's ultimately going to end up, and understand the risks involved with the whole transaction.
Right, and that was a good story that you put forth earlier, where the company was really doing everything right, but they had the device without a drive in it fall off the truck, and they look bad, so their reputation took a hit there. So it really pays to dot your I's and cross your T's in this.
Documentation is the name of the
Right,
game, definitely.
Right. So again, I'd like to really show my appreciation and thank both Jennifer and Kevin for helping us out. I hope everybody on the line got some good information out of this. And I'd like to put a share or save the date out on your calendar for October. We're going to have a webinar on the 27th of the month, and it should be a pretty interesting one. If those on the call aren't already aware, HBK, joined forces with a large managed service provider over the past month, and we're going to be, the entity is going to be called Vertilocity, and we're going to be talking with them, and they're going to cover the project, or the webinar, I should say, the topic of secure cloud migration. So that should be a really timely, worthwhile topic, so that hopefully you can join us, and we'll be sending out invites when we get closer to the 27th. But again, if you have any other questions, feel